It's the Agribusiness Report. I'm Tony St. James, joined today by the Honorable Rick Crawford, who represents the 1st Congressional District of Arkansas. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Well, and again, every time we come to D.C., I wonder, does it ever slow down? It seems as though it's always in a
We've always maintained a pretty brisk pace, but it slowed down a little during COVID. And a lot of that was just there wasn't people here. I mean, now we're back to normal. We're seeing families, particularly this time of year. The Capitol and all the office buildings are just packed. And that sort of contributes to a lot of the pace. But this is a busy calendar. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff going on. We've got some pretty aggressive legislative schedule, and I've been involved in 2 markups before I came over here. So, we're working pretty feverishly.
Do you have the opportunity to, obviously there's the groups that come in, we'll call them lobby groups basically, but do you have the opportunity to just have constituents pop in from time to time, and what's that mean to you as a member?
Well, that's actually probably the most fun part of it, because different industry groups and so on will come up and they'll talk about issues. But what's more fun is when you have families that come up here for maybe the first time, bringing their kids up because it's our nation's capital, and help them on a Capitol tour. Every now and then we'll, when the White House is open to us, we'll be able to give them a White House tour, and that's really cool. So that's the fun part of the job, up here, is helping people experience it and get the most out of their trip here.
I would imagine, as you've had some who popped in, whether they are just guests from the district or maybe along Farm Bureau lines or whatever, talking Farm Bill, reauthorization this year. What are you watching?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a big deal. It always is. The Farm Bill is never an easy piece of legislation to move, as you know, and so in this environment, maybe even more difficult than anything we've experienced. This will be my 3rd one, and none of them have been easy. This one may be more difficult. The budget constraints that we have, the political dynamics at play. So for a variety of reasons, this one may be a little more difficult to maneuver, but it's every bit as important as the others. In fact, maybe more so, and that's because I've said this before, and most people that work in the ag space recognize this: a country that can't feed and clothe itself is vulnerable. And we're seeing that manifest in China, for example. I mean, China is a country that less than 20% of their land mass is arable. They have a population of over 1.4 billion. And that is manifest in belligerence in other parts of the world, because they're trying to reconstitute that Silk Road. They call it the Belt and Road Initiative. They're trying to cultivate resources to be able to feed and clothe themselves, because they can't do it on their own terms. And so they're economically belligerent with other countries, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa and South America and Central America. So we don't want to get to a point where we can't feed and clothe ourselves. So our ability to invest in our own resources as it applies to food and fiber and shelter, that's important. It's essential to our national security.
I'm really glad you brought up China, because we've now heard there are some countries that they've loaned money to that aren't able to pay. Does that concern you, and why?
They do that deliberately. It's called debt trap diplomacy. And here's why it bothers me and why I'm concerned. And I'll give you what could be maybe the worst case scenario. When you look at, for example, our protein sector, we already see that there's significant market share that is in the hands of the Chinese. JBS, for example, is a Brazilian company. It's an international global company, but it's Brazilian owned. Well, if they engage in debt trap diplomacy elsewhere in the region, stands to reason they'll engage in that practice in Brazil. Now, Brazil is part of the BRICS compact: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And so they already have that sort of alignment with China. If for some reason they become beholden to the Chinese and they are highly leveraged, and that could happen, there is the real possibility that a JBS could become part of, or a wholly owned subsidiary of, the Chinese Communist Party. and that would really be bad for the U.S. in terms of market share, total market share in the protein sector. It would be predominantly Chinese. That's one example. That may be an extreme example. Could it happen? Maybe. We'll see. Brazil is a little, it's certainly a stronger economy than what you might see in, say, Costa Rica. However, that leverage potential still exists. And so, that's something that I watch and think about a lot is not just leveraging the smaller countries for strategic purposes, for example, trying to gain a foothold in our hemisphere with regard to a port. But I'm thinking about, the possibility for them to leverage control of a significant player in an industry like agriculture, and that's an example.
Let's roll back to Farm Bill. In one of those 3 Farm Bills, you were able to experience the introduction of ARC and PLC programs. Have they performed the way we wanted them to, or do we need to tweak a bit?
Well, I think there's always room for improvement. I will say I think the PLC has probably had greater appeal than ARC, and that may be as much a geographic dictate as anything. And PLC was very much appealing to our neck of the woods, whereas ARC not so much. But once we got into the first Farm Bill that I was a part of, when PLC and ARC were initially introduced, it didn't take but a couple of years before farmers started to realize, maybe PLC is a better option for us. And so the uptake on PLC was significant. And so that means probably there's a little more pressure in that program, but ARC doesn't necessarily mean that ARC is going away or that there's any push to make ARC go away, but there are scenarios when maybe ARC is preferred. But I think there was more of a view that PLC actually worked better, and so there was a broad uptake there, and that kind of has transcended the geography. Initially, we saw PLC in the southern states, places like Texas, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, in that southern portion, whereas maybe further north, in Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, northern Missouri, they might have been more favorable to ARC, as an example, Minnesota, places like that. Now I think they've seen PLC maybe has a little bit better application, easier to manage, more predictable, and so that's where we have to do a better job in administering PLC. One of those areas is the reference prices, which of course were static. They were set on a 2012 model, and the program didn't even go into effect till 2014. So it's been behind for quite some time. Well, that was fine when we were dealing with almost free money because interest rates were low, input costs were relatively flat by comparison, and then we fast forward to the last couple of years where we've seen inflation through the roof, we've seen interest rates increase, and so cost of production has gone up, and no address of the production cost model that was prescribed in 2012. So that's where we've got to fix that. We've either one of two things, and I think certainly need to update to reflect current cost models, production costs. The other thing I think we need to do is figure out a way to index that model so that we're not having the same problem in 2 or 3 years, and that there should be some sort of reflection of actual costs that's reflective of the economic constraints that are put on farmers.
With some of those changes, could we eliminate the need, at least some of the need, for ad hoc?
Well, I hope so. And I think there's a variety of things we could do to address the ad hoc disaster scenarios that come up. One is probably a broader application of farm or crop insurance, taking more of a whole farm approach, requiring that as an eligibility requirement to participate in ad hoc disaster relief programs. A lot of people that do make that investment in crop insurance feel like they're being treated unfairly because in a disaster scenario, people that have not purchased farm or crop insurance in many cases are eligible and maybe first in line to actually receive ad hoc disaster relief. And so that's where I think we all need to be singing from the same hymnal with regard to how we manage risk as it applies to natural disasters, number one. Number two, I think there's some things we can do outside of the scope of the Ag Committee that relates to better managing those disasters. One is a bill that we've been working for actually since I got here, and that is to create self-funded disaster relief accounts. They're much like an HSA that people use to manage their health care, but it would be used to manage unexpected occurrences on your farm, tax incentives to fund those accounts, withdraw the money for operational purposes at no tax penalty. And so it does resemble an HSA, but it's designed to help provide immediate relief to farmers. If and when an ad hoc disaster relief measure is taken, sometimes it takes a long time to deliver. Crop insurance adjustments sometimes can take a long time to deliver. Well, if you're able to fund that in the interim until one or both of those scenarios kick in, at least that's the difference maker in keeping you in business for another year versus maybe going out of business. And so I think we can put a few more tools in the tool shed for farmers to use.
So good seeing you.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for the work that you just continue to do. Come back and see us.
I hope I don't have to wait till a year.
Well, then let's do this again soon.
Okay, sounds good.
And next time we'll talk Cuba. We haven't talked Cuba in a while.
Love to.
So it's the Honorable Rick Crawford, who represents the 1st Congressional District of Arkansas and joins us on today's Agribusiness Report.